Welcome to 28storms.com. This is the second video update for this Wednesday, September 7th. The first one came before we had an upgrade to Tropical Storm Nate in the southwest Gulf of Mexico. This just occurred within the last 2 hours, so this is just a little brief update on what we are anticipating. First off, this is the most recent Hurricane Center track forecast for Tropical Storm Nate, courtesy of weatherunderground.com. Nate currently has maximum sustained winds of 45 miles per hour with gusts exceeding 55 miles per hour. It's drifting off toward the east-southeast at 2 miles per hour. However, notice that a slow drift or nearly stationary movement is expected over the next 48 hours, and it's really not until 2 p.m. Saturday that we expect to see more of a turn toward the west into the northeast coast of Mexico. But keep in mind that this storm is not expected to be moving all that much over the next 5 days, so there is a little added uncertainty, and notice that the cone of error extends into the southern Texas coast. There is much better model agreement this afternoon compared to yesterday, and this was discussed in the first video several hours ago. Initially, we had two model camps. One was taking this into Mexico, whereas the others were taking this more toward the north into the central Gulf Coast due to a trough over there. But now the models are beginning to favor the Mexican solution, and there is no reason to disagree with that based on what we are currently seeing on satellite imagery and also just given the trends. And there is still a fair amount of model variance in terms of the intensity forecast. We see that the lower end models are ranging anywhere from a minimal tropical storm to the higher end model suggesting an upwards of a Category 1 or even Category 2 hurricane. And upper level conditions aren't the most favorable right now, however they could become a little bit more favorable with time. And I see no reason why Nate can't become the next hurricane of the season. Unless, of course, the low-level circulation remains too close to the coastline to really develop. But if we go ahead and take the latest forecast track and believe that it's going to be more so over the open waters of the western Gulf, then we should begin to see some steady intensification. But as of right now, it's still just trying to get its act together. The Hurricane Center discussion noted that the surface circulation is well defined. However, it still looks partially exposed, with some of it sticking out here in the northern semicircle, and that could be attributed to some of the dry air. In fact, much of the northwest Gulf of Mexico is extremely dry, especially for being this early in the year, or considering that it's early September, not quite October or November just yet, and that is placing a squeeze on the northwest quadrant of the storm. However, those northerly winds are fairly light, so we're not seeing that much in the way of wind shear over the storm itself, so that's going to mitigate the dry air's influence to some extent. And based on the latest 18Z GFS 250 millibar forecast, it looks like some of those northerly winds over the western Gulf are going to steadily begin to relax, especially as we go into 36 and 48 hours. So I would say it's rather unlikely that some of the extremely bone dry air over the northwest Gulf will be able to successfully infiltrate into the low-level inner core all that much. If anything, we may have to worry about some slight southwest wind shear impeding the development of the storm within the next 2 to 5 days. But overall, this environment still looks healthy enough to where it should be able to steadily intensify. In terms of the forecast track, there is still quite a lot of disagreement as to how far north the storm is going to make it, but overall it looks like it's going to primarily threaten much of the eastern half of the Mexican coastline. This is the latest 18Z GFS sea level pressure and precipitation forecast, and as we steadily advance this, you'll notice that it does develop our tropical cyclone further, especially as we get into the 2 to 3 day period. And now we are looking at the forecast for Saturday afternoon. So Tropical Storm Nate should be a high-end tropical storm. It could even make a run at becoming a minimal hurricane before landfall, and it takes it inland fairly far toward the south. And also, one thing that we also have to keep in mind is that if the low-level circulation hangs around the coast for too long, then it could begin to significantly dissipate even before the core makes it directly onto the shore. If we turn to the 500 millibar steering forecast, we can see why the GFS is taking the storm on a general westerly track. First off, this is the current hour, and we still see that there is a fairly strong trough associated with the remnants of Lee, especially over the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and we can begin to see Tropical Storm Nate forming here close to the Bay of Campeche. But notice how as we advance this into the future, we see that the trough is expected to begin lifting out, and the western Atlantic ridge will eventually connect with the Texas ridge over the central Gulf of Mexico, and that's going to inhibit the storm from really gaining too much in the way of any significant latitude. We can see this quite clearly by 84 hours or early Sunday morning. We see that there is a fairly good amount of ridging right here over to the north of the storm, and that should eventually push this more into mainland Mexico, especially as we go into early in the day on Monday. We really see that Texas ridge beginning to amplify over here, which would suggest that this is going to continue moving off toward the west. What adds to the confidence that this will be a westerly moving storm once all is said and done is the fact that the 12Z afternoon run of the European model has also switched over toward the western solution. If you recall yesterday, the European was one of the few models that took this more toward the central Gulf of Mexico, with the trough still hanging around here between Louisiana and the Florida Panhandle. But since then, the model has shifted back toward the west as we go into 24, 48, and 72 hours. Notice after 72 hours especially that this trough is going to begin lifting out while the Atlantic ridge begins to extend into the southeast Gulf of Mexico. That's going to allow the storm to gain a little bit more latitude than the GFS is indicating, but they come into better agreement as we go into day 4, where you really begin to see signs of that Texas ridge beginning to come back into the picture, and then by day 5, this type of pattern would guarantee that the storm is going to stay at least just to the south of Brownsville, Texas. So all interests along the eastern coast of Mexico from Veracruz northward, including interest down here near the Bay of Campeche, need to be keeping a very close watch on developing Tropical Storm Nate. In the meantime, it looks as though a Tropical Storm Nate landfall somewhere along the U.S. Gulf Coast is rather unlikely, but all interests in the Gulf of Mexico are still advised to keep up with the weather, especially over the next 5 to 6 days, especially interests in southern Texas, since you are still within the 5-day margin of error. So that is your update on Tropical Storm Nate from us here at 28storms.com. Please check back frequently for more extensive video analysis, and don't forget to use the Hurricane Tracker app if you're away from your computer.